Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts. We like to unearth stories that not many people know about. And in this episode, we look at the first bank robbery in Australia. Throughout history, we've heard many stories of robberies, especially bank robberies, Bonnie and Clyde, and many others who met a bitter end. This story takes us to early Sydney, 1828, where many convicts have now finished their sentence and been given tickets of leave. A few men working around the area of the Rocks in Sydney come up with a plan to rob the newly built Bank of Australia. The Bank of Australia is our second bank, established 10 years after the first, being the Bank of New South Wales. We know from our Mary Raby episode, she was part alongside Governor Lachlan Macquarie in getting that established. But the Bank of Australia didn't survive long after the first bank robbery in Australia. It is believed that a Charles or James Dingle had only just received a ticket of leave the year before, working around the area of Daly Street in a road gang who would have been set up at the time to fix the streets around Sydney area. Unlike the earlier convicts that had to do the same thing though in chains, these men were a little freer to work. But on this occasion, Charles Dingle passed by a drain, and when he looked down, he realised that this drain running beneath George Street across to the tank stream provided access to the foundations of the bank. Charles began to develop a plan to rob the bank. The bank had only really just been opened. Now Charles had a mate, William Farrell, who he thought could help him in seeing this plan come to fruition. He must have trusted him to let him know. They decided that they needed more men to help them, so they contacted Thomas Turner, who was actually employed to help build the site of the bank 2 years earlier. They found another man, William Blackstone, who had a ticket of leave, who was working in a blacksmith shop near York Street. They'd known Blackstone for his reputation. He'd been a former London safecracker, known as Sudden Solomon, so they desperately needed his help in order to get into the bank. A third man was acquired. His name was Thomas Woodward. He was known for getting rid of money and items quite quickly, and he would help them disperse the money or whatever it was that they found in the safe, so as not to get caught with anything in their possession. Now Turner, who'd helped build the bank, knew exactly where the bank's strong room was on the floor plan. He was able to also let them know whereabouts there was a weak spot in the foundation of the bank. They began to plan how they were going to do it. When the best time to break in the bank was, they believed, was when it closed on a Saturday night, as fewer people would be loitering around Lower George Street on Sunday. It was sometime in August of 1828 that the four of them slipped through the manhole, which was the drain, on the east side of George Street between where the Underwood building was being built and George Thornton's Union Hotel. The men were of shorter stature, luckily, so they didn't have too much trouble getting into the tunnel area. It was believed that William Blackstone had more experience in this kind of work, so they let him kind of take the lead. Turner led them down to where the weakest spot in the foundations of the bank was. They decided that the job would take a few weekends to complete. In the weeks that followed, Turner decided to pull out, that as he'd worked on building the bank, suspicion would come to him very soon. So he decided that he would let the others handle it. Blackstone was a craftsman, and he'd forged the right tools for the job and worked away at the foundation, and soon enough the footings of the bank were exposed. Now something happens after they've been working for some weeks. September the 14th was a Saturday, and Blackstone's master kept him back at the shop to do work for him. This meant that the boys working on the job had to employ another man to keep going for the day, so they had to let in John Clayton. Now by the time Blackstone got back to where they were all digging around, he was most unpleased that another person had joined them. This now meant that each of them got a little less. He worked his anger out on the digging, chipping away at the mortar. Now, by the end of that day, exhausted and Blackstone a little cranky, they ended up into a brawl and barely escaped arrest. Another setback in their plan was on Governor Macquarie's Day. It was compulsory for all convicts to attend church. Dingle was able to get the men Blackstone, Clayton and Farrell out of having to go, but he had to go himself. So he ended up sending a man by the name of Val Rook to go and let the boys know they didn't have to attend church, which is quite strange. But this now meant another man knew about the plan, and now it would be divided 6 ways. Hopefully, they would keep their mouths shut about this now. They wouldn't let any more people in on this. Soon enough, they made their way through into the bank. They sent Farrell in as he was the smallest of the group. He took a lantern in and quickly whispered that he was on the other side of the foundation wall. Yes, it was all there. Farrell quickly opened each box, passing the contents out through the hole in the wall. There was paper money and coins, including £14,500 in banknotes, £750 in British silver, 2,000 gold sovereigns, and over 20,030 Spanish dollars. This was a fortune in Sydney for 1828. However, they didn't just take the money and run. They must have been a little overexcited, because they got into the strong room and trashed it, tearing up receipts and bills, tossing ledgers. It was a bit uncalled for. Perhaps it was a bit of a screw you to the bank. But needless to say, they got away with the loot. Now it would be up to Thomas Woodward to start dispersing of the silver and trying to get the money back for it. Now on the Monday morning, September 16th, 1828, the teller of the Bank of Australia unlocked the door of the strong room. In the darkness, he reached for the spot where his ledger on Saturday night was placed, but he couldn't get to it. It was so dark he couldn't see, so he decided to pop upstairs and grab a candle. When he returned, he realised the devastation inside the strong room. Only a large chest containing a silver plate remained untouched in the corner. The guys didn't work very smoothly, because they found in the drain that the robbers had left their tools. Sydney's Chief Constable, George Gilkes, found a crowbar, a sword saw, a stonemason's scounder, a broken lantern, and several empty bottles of rum. The town went into a frenzy. Who had done this? Governor Darling, who was the governor at the time, offered an absolute pardon and free passage back home to England for information leading to the capture of the culprits and recovery of the stolen money. The paper money was pretty much worthless to the thieves. The circulation of the 20, 10 and £5 notes would have been quickly spotted in Sydney's small commercial community. Soon after, the Sydney Gazette published the numbers of the stolen notes. Neither the notes or the cash ever came to light. Now this means that they would have had to have dumped the notes, unless Possibly Thomas Woodward may have got them by boat out of the country. We will never know. Cracks were starting to appear almost immediately. A few weeks after the robbery, a letter was pushed under the front door of the bank. An anonymous writer announced that the bank robbers could be found at an address at a waterside residence at Mellors Point. The police rushed in and arrests were made, but the men were released because there was lack of evidence. Many stories circulated as to who was involved, including highly reputable members of the colony had organised it and benefited from the proceeds. Another rumour was that the loot had been buried somewhere around Mossman. Some say that the Spanish dollars and other coins were buried at the domain. If these rumours were true, they'd be buried way below the buildings that currently reside there now. In 1893, a lady came forward after the death of her husband and said that she knew where the loot had been buried. It had apparently been buried near the domain around where Mrs. Macquarie's chair was. The Premier at the time, Sir George Dibbs, had authorised an excavation of the area, but nothing was ever found. Now, things kind of unravelled around 3 years later. Apparently, after the robbery, Blackstone had gotten into gambling and seemed to have lost his share of the loot, squandering it on the gambling tables. When trying to rob a house in Macquarie Street that was being used as a gambling den, a member of the Night's Watchman caught them in the act, trying to rob the home. As a result, the man that was with Blackstone was killed and Blackstone was wounded. He was sent to Norfolk Island, which was, at the time, a place of extreme punishment. Now it seems that Blackstone's kind of freaked out now. He was looking down the barrel of 14 years at Norfolk Island, and it was extremely awful to be at Norfolk Island for even a short amount of time. So we can only assume that the pressure got to him and he buckled underneath it, telling the authorities that he knew who'd committed the robbery of that bank. He had obviously seen this as a way to get back to Sydney and possibly get a ticket of leave. To help police with this unsolved case nearly 3 years ago. So they shipped Blackstone back to Sydney. He was brought in for questioning and under the pressure of it confessed everything, including implicating himself. Straight away, a warrant was issued for William Farrell and Charles Dingle, both of whom were living at the time in Sydney. The third man, Thomas Woodward, was charged as a receiver of the stolen property, making him an accessory after the fact. The other men involved in the robbery could not be found. Now, on June 17, 1831, Dingle, Farrell and Woodward appeared before Mr. Justice Dowling at a military jury. Blackstone took his place in the witness box and told the court the full story, even advising how they shared the notes on Sunday evening and returned to the drain in the pouring rain at 3 o'clock Monday morning to haul out the 4 boxes of coins. He even recounted how Dingle had been the lookout holding an umbrella above ground when he was approached by the night watchman and sent them away, keeping the guys down the drain and out of sight. Blackstone also recounted how he'd made an agreement with Woodward, offering Woodward £1,133 in return for £1,000 in new banknotes. Woodward had agreed and they'd both gone down to the bank together. Woodward told Blackstone to wait outside, warning him at the same time to be careful of the police loitering. The warning was a subtle threat because Blackstone never saw Woodward again, at least not until now. But what could Blackstone do? Run to the police and say, "Hey, Woodward just duped me out of my stolen loot." But this very well could be why Blackstone ratted them out in the end, carrying that grudge all those years of how he'd been cheated out of thousands of pounds. Woodward had a bit of money from what was left over after the robbery. He hired a man, a successful lawyer, William Foster, to fight for them. William Foster said that these men were now free. They'd completed their sentences without any other trouble. Who was this man, William Blackstone, who had been put to Norfolk Island after stealing? It almost looked as though it was going to work in their favour. However, Judge Dowling passed the sentence of 10 years hard labour for Dingle, Farrell and Woodward. In a strange turn of events, Blackstone was given a ticket of leave, giving him free passage home, which was the reward for coming clean. Funny that even though he was part of the plan and part of the robbery, this must have granted him immunity, so as he was able to claim the reward of going back to England. However, Blackstone couldn't help himself and was caught stealing from a shop before he even cashed in his ticket of leave. What an idiot. So naturally, Blackstone is placed onto a chain gang with hard labour, exactly where the others had been sent. How funny is that? He'd ratted them out and was home free, literally home free. He just had to take the ticket and go, but he couldn't help himself. He was a crook, the most crooked kind of crooks. Ratting out his pals, it all caught up with Blackstone. He eventually was sent to Cockatoo Island Penal Station in the Sydney Harbour. But he wasn't there long before being released, around 1840. You would think that he was home free again, maybe not having enough cash to go back to England, but he'd done his time and he was back in the settlement again. However, in 1844, William Blackstone, Sudden Solomon, was found in a swamp at Woolloomooloo. Had he been murdered by one of the guys he ratted on? Sudden Solomon had come to a sudden end. And that's not all that came to a sudden end. A year before William Blackstone died, the Bank of Australia folded. It did never really recover from when they wiped it out. Carol Baxter has a novel, Breaking the Bank, that details the robbery back in 1828. The Bank of Australia, she says, was founded by John MacArthur. We know him from a couple of our episodes, including the Death Fleet. But it was known as the Gentleman's Bank, whereas the Bank of New South Wales was the People's Bank. This may even tie in with the rumours that some of the prominent Sydney citizens may have been in cahoots with the robbers. There are so many different conspiracies surrounding it. But it is quite an interesting story, and what a scandal for the time. Carol also says that the convicts or ex-convicts were always trying to undermine the government and the police, and that may be also why Judge Dowling passed such a harsh 10 years and 15 possible years for Dingle, Farrell and Woodward. We do hope you enjoyed this episode of the first bank robbery in Australia. Stay tuned for our upcoming episodes. Now don't forget to hit the like, subscribe and slap that notification button so you're aware when we're posting new videos.